Welcome. We have the wonderful opportunity to have a conversation with Steve Graham today. We're going to be discussing his manuscript, Effectiveness of Literacy Programs, Balancing Reading and Writing Instruction, a Meta-Analysis. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here.
Oh, we're so excited to have you here. Can you tell us about yourself and how you got interested in your topic?
So my primary interest academically is in children's writing and its development. And for almost 30 years, myself and my colleagues have been looking at effective ways of teaching writing. And in 2007, we published a report with Carnegie Corporation called Writing Next to kind of say to policymakers, we know how to teach writing. And it had a little bit of a bump. And as we thought about it, we thought, we need to connect our wagon, so to speak, to something that's equally powerful, and that is to reading. So we started taking a look at the effects of writing on reading, and then reading on writing, and this is the extension, kind of the endpoint extension of looking at the two together. How does reading and writing, when you provide kind of balanced instruction in terms of time, impact reading performance and writing performance? So the initial point actually was writing, but I think you could go either way on this. Reading is important to writing, and writing is important to reading.
And that's a great segue. So tell us a little bit about your RRQ study.
So what we did for the RRQ study is we conducted a meta-analysis to take a look at what happens when you provide instruction that's balanced. And by balanced in terms of reading and writing, what we're really talking about here, at least 60% of the instruction has to be either reading or writing. So it's a 60-40 kind of split, or 40-60, depending upon which side of the aisle that you're looking at. And we wanted to try to look at the best evidence available. So we limited ourselves to true experiments that provided that instruction and quasi-experiments that provided that instruction. So in the true experiments, students or classrooms were randomly assigned. In the quasi-experiments, they weren't, but there was always at least one outcome measure for reading or an outcome measure for writing. In the best scenario, there were both. We were able to locate, surprisingly, out of the million of studies in reading and writing, we were only able to locate 47 studies that took a look at this. Part of that is because we had pretty stringent criteria for entering into it. And so, with the 47 studies, what I can say is they were mostly quasi-experiments. About 20% were true experiments, but the quasi-experiments were pretty solid. So we feel fairly confident in our findings that reading and writing instruction together, when balanced, improves both reading and improves both writing.
That sounds like a really important finding. So now that you've done that study, what would you tell teachers?
Well, I'm going to start with something that's going to I'm going to start that again. I'm going to start with something that sounds kind of surprising, given that our primary findings are combined reading and writing instruction makes a difference for both. So obviously, we need to be looking at ways of bringing these two together. However, I would also make the case that we need to be providing separate instruction for both reading and writing as well. So I think there's a space for both of those. Now, obviously, I'm going a little bit beyond the data here because we did not look at what happens with separate reading and writing instruction. But the reason I'm doing that is our effect sizes for reading and writing with the combined programs was a healthy third of a standard deviation jump in either reading or writing performance. And when we look at specific reading instruction or specific writing instruction, we get that or even better in some instances. So I don't want us to forget that we need to be providing combined reading and writing instruction, but we also want to keep in mind that separate writing and separate reading instruction can also make a difference. So it's a little bit counterintuitive to what you might have thought I would have said.
Oh, it sounds interesting. So what does that look like in a typical language arts classroom instruction day?
Well, so I think one of the things that we'd like to see more of is you have reading and writing programs that interconnect in terms of, and as a practical example of this, let's think of something like teaching phonics and spelling. So there's a place where we can interconnect our instruction very specifically so that one supports the other. If we're thinking about reading comprehension and text structure in terms of writing, we can be taking a look at what we read to find out what the elements are of the types of texts that we're reading, and then use that as a springboard for generating ideas and creating our writing. And so that's the way in which these kind of interconnect together, is we want to look for those places where we can make the maximum use of the two. And so one supports the other. But we also need to provide kind of a specific time, I think, for things that are specific just to writing, because not everything that we're going to be reading is going to fit all the different ways we might be writing. And I think we want to do the same thing for reading. So I see a combined time, if you think about an hour and a half for elementary school as kind of the literacy time, I would say about 1 hour of that time is combined. And we have another 30 minutes of that time that is used in various ways around reading and writing.
So that's interesting. So it seems like there's two main points: time, and that's combined and unique time for each topic. But then it's also quality. It's how do these two elements support each other?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point about quality that you just brought up. So a caveat in our study is that while 80% of the studies that we looked at, or better, produce positive effects for reading, writing, and or both, that wasn't always the case that they created combined effects. So for example, whole language was one of the procedures that was looked at. And what we found was that for reading, whole language had a positive, about a third of a standard deviation jump in reading performance. No effect on writing. And so what we're left with on this is that the type of writing that may have been provided, or writing instruction that may have been provided, may not have been of high quality. And in fact, it doesn't look a lot like what we see in terms of effective writing practices in general. Now, there's also another possibility, is that in those combined programs, teachers emphasize reading more than they do writing. And that's probably not going to come as a surprise for many people when I say that, because that's what we typically see in schools. So it's quality and time and the interaction of those together.
Sounds important. So if I'm a parent, what's some takeaway messages?
Well, I think a couple of things are takeaway messages from here. If you combine this with the other information from the meta-analysis that we've conducted, as your kids are growing up, you want to emphasize both reading and writing at home. Obviously, this meta-analysis is not about home, but when you look at the collective results, we want to look for ways of emphasizing reading because of its impact on writing, and writing because of its impact on reading. But I'll say another thing that I think is really important is that if I was a parent, now I'm a little older at this point, but I was a parent at one time of a young child, I think the first thing that we want to do is we want to ask our child's teachers what they're doing to promote reading and writing in the classroom across the school year, and how they're going to bring that together. And if the teacher is kind of stunned about that question and can't quite get an answer, then it will help them think about this a little bit more, and it'll put this more on the radar for both teachers. And I would also say we could ask the same thing with principals as well. So we need to be out there advocating.
I like that. And I think that's important. As a parent, I can do things at home. I can read and write with my child, but I can also ask the right questions when I'm chatting with her teacher.
Absolutely. And also, again, the principal. So sometimes if you want to really have the big effect, it's the principal that you go to.
Or the district and personnel and policymakers. So, Steve, where are you taking this research next? What are the next steps?
So in terms of thinking about this, I had mentioned some other meta-analysis, one that was published by the Carnegie Corporation called Writing to Read, which looked at, again, the effects of increasing reading and reading instruction on writing. We just finished a meta-analysis that was accepted in a journal called Review of Educational Research, looking the other way. What happens when you increase reading what happens when you increase reading instruction on writing, and again, positive effects. We're currently involved in a meta-analysis that we're taking a look at kids who find reading challenging, and we're looking at studies that are descriptive that compare their writing performance with kids who don't find reading challenging. Again, trying to isolate, at least in this case, reading's effects on writing. And we're part of the way through on that study. We're also doing some studies that are empirical, taking a look at reading and writing connections in terms of model building, and actually starting tomorrow, I'll start writing up a study taking a look at motivation in both reading and writing to look at its effects on literacy performance. And in many ways, I've become increasingly interested in motivation, and so some of my work is going to center around those connections. We've been mostly focusing in on, actual performance, how well you read, how well you write, but not looking at motivation in reading and writing and how they connect cross literacy. So I'm really excited to see what happens there.
We're excited as well. And you can see more of Steve's meta-analysis on the early view in the Reading Research Quarterly website. Thank you so much, Steve, for being with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and thanks for asking me to be on.